The gate camera catches it first. A bag hitting gravel, then a hand pointing back at the man who just stepped out of a moving car. Somewhere behind that iron fence sits a fortune nobody in this driveway knows exists. A guard scans a screen, no results. Then the screen changes. 4 words, white text. A name nobody at this wedding, this funeral, this family was ever supposed to read out loud. Every camera on the property goes still, because the woman driving away just made the worst mistake of her life. And she doesn't know it yet. The gate isn't opening for her. It's opening for him. Nobody warns you the day your marriage ends will also be the day you find out who you are. The gate at Havenwood Manor doesn't open for money, it opens for blood. And on a grey Tuesday morning in early November, my wife didn't know the difference. She thought she did. That was the problem. Angela stopped the SUV 40 feet from the checkpoint. She turned to me with a face I'd learned to read over 8 years of marriage, calm on the surface, something else underneath them. Something that had been building since the moment her mother climbed into the back seat that morning, wearing black that read more like a magazine spread than mourning. "I need you to switch with Victor," she said. Flat, final, like she was reading off a list. I didn't move. She reached across me and opened the door herself. A man who fixes other people's broken buildings doesn't belong walking through that gate. A pause, long enough to hurt. "Get out." Them. Her mother dropped my bag onto the gravel without looking at me. Victor stepped around the front of the car and slid into the seat I'd just been thrown from. Smooth as a man closing a deal he'd been working for months, because that's exactly what he was doing. I stood in the driveway, bag at my feet, watching the SUV crawl toward the checkpoint like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just been erased from my own wife's life in under 30 seconds. The guard scanned his tablet. No results. Angela pointed back at me through the windshield, already annoyed, already rehearsing the explanation she'd give the guard. And then the gate moved, away from her. Every camera on that driveway went still for a second I'll never fully explain. The screen mounted beside the checkpoint booth lit up in plain white text, 4 words, Darnell Cooper Reed, sole family heir. Them. My wife had just thrown the owner of this estate out of her car. If you're only catching this now, stay with me. Because what happens behind that gate is the part nobody in that car saw coming. Least of all me. I'd spent 15 years restoring things other people gave up on. Churches with rotting bell towers, courthouses eaten slow by a century of weather. Them. Libraries where the limestone had cracked so deep you could put your fist through it if you didn't know better. That was the job. Colleagues called it noble. Angela, in the last year of our marriage, called it a hobby that paid poorly. She wasn't always like that. I need to say that clearly because it's too easy to look back on 8 years and decide the whole thing was rotten from the foundation. It wasn't. 6 years before that morning, her father had a cardiac event in the middle of the night. I drove 3 hours through rain without being asked. Sat with her in a waiting room until 4 in the morning. Didn't say much. Didn't do anything that belonged in a movie. Just stayed. She told me later, that was the night she decided to marry me. Not because I impressed her. Because I showed up. The man she married lived in a rented duplex outside Richmond. Drove a truck with 140,000 miles on it. Thought a good Saturday meant rewiring lath and plaster in a building most of the county had already forgotten existed. I wasn't ashamed of any of it. I was good at what I did. The work mattered, even when nobody was watching it matter. Somewhere around year 3, I noticed the shift. Small at first. Someone would ask what her husband did for a living and Angela would smile too tight, then change the subject fast. She wasn't lying, she just stopped volunteering the truth. The change didn't come all at once. It came in layers. The way damage comes to an old building, slow enough you miss it until the structure starts to lean. Her friends were buying second homes on the coast. Her co-workers were getting quoted in trade magazines. Her mother, Lorraine, had a gift, a real talent for calling at exactly the wrong moment to mention what somebody else's husband had just bought or achieved. Because that was Lorraine's love language. Comparison dressed up as concern. I want to be honest about 3 nights. I've replayed them more times than I can count. And I still don't know if saying something back then would have changed anything. The first, a dinner at her friend Denise's place, 6 bedrooms, a dining table carved from a single slab of walnut. Somebody made a joke about a school teacher one of the other women had dated, called him sweet but going nowhere. Angela laughed, louder than the joke deserved. I sat there holding a glass of water like it might steady something in my chest. The second, my 35th birthday. I'd booked a table at the Italian place in the Fan District, the one from our first date. She called at 5 that evening. A networking thing came up. She promised to make it up to me. She never did. The third, late October. Lorraine sitting at our kitchen island with a glass of wine saying not exactly to me, Not exactly to anyone that a smart woman doesn't marry a man for who he is. She marries him for who he's about to become. Angela didn't answer. She just set her glass down. Slow, careful. Like she was agreeing without wanting to admit it out loud. I told myself it was a phase, a stretch of insecurity that would pass once the noise around us settled. I was wrong. And I think some part of me knew I was wrong even while I was telling myself the lie. There's something else Angela never knew. Something almost nobody knew. My name on paper wasn't the whole truth of who I was. I was born Darnell Reed. When I was 8, 2 men tried to pull me into a car in the parking lot of my elementary school. They didn't get far, got caught before they reached the street. But my father never got over it. Never talked about it, not once in 30 years, except in the decision it produced. That same week, he decided I'd carry my mother's last name Cooper from then on. No public records connecting me to the Reed name. He wanted me raised understanding what it meant to build a life with your own hands, not one handed to you by an accident of birth. My mother died when I was 11, Deborah Cooper. The name she gave me was the only thing of hers I carried forward into adulthood, and some nights that felt like both a gift and a debt I'd never fully pay off. Harold Reed wasn't a man who showed up on magazine covers, didn't give interviews. He built Reed Meridian Holdings from a small freight rail operation in North Carolina into a private conglomerate, clean energy, maritime shipping, water infrastructure almost entirely out of public view. The company's real value was never formally. People in finance knew the name. Almost none of them knew the number. $47 billion. He used to sit me down in the study at Havenwood and tell me the only people worth trusting were the ones who showed up before they knew what you were worth. He said it so many times it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like a warning. I visited a few times a year, quiet, careful. We'd walk the back trails on the property, argue about the ethics of large-scale development, argue harder about how a man should structure a charitable trust so it actually did what it claimed to do. I never brought Angela. Not because I didn't want her to know. I thought about telling her dozens of times. But every time I got close, something would happen. A joke at a dinner party made at the expense of someone who couldn't afford to be in the room. A comment about a coworker's husband who'd wasted his potential teaching public school. Small things, forgivable on their own. Together they formed a pattern I didn't know how to trust with the truth. I kept waiting for the woman who sat with me in that hospital waiting room to come back. I think I was still waiting when she met Victor Bryant. She told me it started at a networking event at the Jefferson Hotel. A new contact. Someone who ran a mid-size investment fund and had the kind of charm that only comes from years of deliberate practice. Victor started taking her to dinners where the menu didn't list prices. Sent gifts not flashy but precise, the kind that tell you someone has been paying close attention. He told her she was operating below her level. He made her believe, in a remarkably short window of time, that the central problem in her life had a name, and that name was Darnell. What Angela didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until it was almost too late to matter, was that Victor had identified her before they ever met. His fund had spent 2 years circling Reed Meridian's clean energy division. Quiet inquiries, deflected every time, patient the way predators are patient. His research team cross-referenced every professional contact adjacent to my father's inner circle. Angela ran communications for a non-profit that had once organized a fundraiser my father quietly backed. Her name sat at the edge of a very long list. That was enough. Not because Victor understood the full shape of who I was to Harold Reed. Because any thread leading toward Havenwood was a thread worth pulling. He engineered the introduction. Everything after that was deliberate. My father found out, months before I did. His security team flagged Victor the moment the inquiries into the clean energy division started looking less like curiosity and more like a strategy. When Angela's name surfaced in that same report, my father didn't call me. Instead, he brought in Catherine Hill, his legal director of over 20 years, and told her to document everything, store it offline. Told her that if something happened to him before this resolved itself, she'd know what to do with it. He didn't want me reacting from anger. He wanted me holding the truth in both hands before I ever had to look at it. That was how Harold Reed operated. He never told you a storm was coming. He just made sure you had shelter before the first drop hit the roof. I didn't know any of this on the Tuesday morning Catherine called to tell me my father had a stroke at Havenwood the night before, and hadn't survived it. I was sitting in my truck outside a church I was supposed to inspect that day, Charlottesville. Cold morning, windshield fogged at the edges. I didn't move for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Whatever complicated grief I'd carried for years, the loneliness of loving a father I couldn't publicly claim collapsed in on itself all at once, right there in the driver's seat. With the church bell tower I was supposed to be measuring sitting silent behind the windshield like it already knew them. Angela came home that evening and found me at the kitchen table. Lights off. I told her I'd lost someone important, that I needed to attend a private service at a property called Havenwood, out in Rappahannock County. She asked if she could come. I should have said no. I wasn't thinking clearly. Grief does that, strips the guardrails right off your judgment, and some stubborn part of me still wanted to believe the marriage had a floor under it somewhere. I said yes. She didn't ask who had died. She asked what the guest list would look like. The morning of the service, Angela hired a car, dressed in black that read more like a red carpet than a funeral. Lorraine sat in the back with the settled confidence of a woman who'd already decided this day was an opportunity dressed up as a tragedy. Victor sat beside her, jacket pressed, expression composed into something meant to look like respect. I rode in the passenger seat. Watched the Virginia hills roll by, brown and bare at the edges of November, and thought about the last phone call I'd had with my father 3 weeks earlier. Unremarkable. Something about a drainage issue on the eastern edge of the property. I hadn't known it would be the last one. No one in that car asked how I was doing. Angela and Victor talked in low voices about who they planned to approach at the service. Lorraine made a comment about how well-maintained the property looked, the way a prospective buyer sizes up resale value. Not a mourner sizes up grief. I said nothing. Watched the iron gates of Havenwood appear at the end of the long approach road. Felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the people sitting behind me. Then Angela stopped the car. That's where I started this. The seat swap, the bag on the gravel. The word Victor never once used for 6 years and suddenly deployed like a coronation. Sweetheart, honey. We'll enter together. She turned to me, calm, cold. A man who fixes other people's broken buildings doesn't belong walking through that gate. 2 words after that, get out. Her mother dropped my bag. Victor took my seat without looking at me once. Angela told me the marriage was over, voice flat, final. The tone you use closing an account that stopped paying you back. Then she drove forward. I stood there, bag at my feet, watching the taillights. The gate didn't open for her, it opened for me. Terry Coleman came through first, the way Terry always moved. Unhurried, certain. Like a man who'd been rehearsing this exact walk for years without knowing it. 6 members of the household staff behind him. He stopped in front of me, straightened slightly. Said the words that would end up rearranging every assumption my wife had ever made about me. Welcome home, Mr. Cooper. Behind him, the screen on the gatehouse wall glowed white. 4 words. Darnell Cooper, read them. Sole family heir. I could see Angela's face in the SUV's side mirror as it idled at the guard booth, going nowhere. The expression of someone realizing the ground they'd been standing on was never actually ground. I picked up my bag. Terry fell into step beside me. We walked through the gate together without a word. There was nothing that needed saying yet. He didn't take me through the main entrance. He led me around the east wing, down the side corridor. My father always preferred the one lined with framed architectural drawings of Havenwood's original construction, dating back to 1907. I used to walk that hallway as a boy and wonder what kind of man commissions a house like this. By the time I understood the answer, I'd already decided I didn't want to be that kind of man. My father, to his credit, never once tried to talk me out of that. The house was full of people I half recognized, faces from my father's professional world, board members, legal representatives, a couple of names I knew from the news but had never met in person. They moved through the rooms with the particular restraint of people who understood something significant was happening and were performing their best version of solemnity for each other. Nobody in that crowd knew who I was. That had always been the arrangement. My father built an entire empire on discretion, and somehow the one thing he never let slip, even in death, was his son's face. Catherine Hill met me in the hallway outside my father's private study. Trim, late 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back with the kind of precision that told you she'd been managing enormous consequences for 2 decades without ever once raising her voice. She put a hand briefly on my arm, said she was sorry, then said the sentence that told me the day wasn't going to slow down for my grief. He left instructions. Before anything else today, you need to come inside. The study looked exactly the way I remembered it. Wide oak desk. A wall of books that had actually been read, not staged for effect. A brass clock on the mantel my father wound by hand every single evening of his life, rain or shine, good news. Catherine set a wooden box on the desk. Inside were 3 things: a handwritten letter, a small offline drive, a playback device small enough to fit in one hand. She said my father had asked her to brief me on the practical contents of the letter, First the business instructions, the board contacts, the legal framework before I read any of it myself. She went through it methodically. Numbers, names, contingencies, all of it delivered in a voice that stayed level even when the numbers themselves weren't. Then she set the box back in front of me. The rest is his own words. Take whatever time you need. I connected the drive, pressed play. My father appeared on the small screen, seated in the same chair I was sitting near now, in the same room. He looked older than I remembered from our last call. Thinner too, in a way I hadn't caught over the phone, hidden by distance and static and my own refusal to notice. He didn't ease into it. He spoke the way he always did, like he'd already delivered the introduction in his head, and was skipping straight to the part that mattered. I've known about Victor Bryant longer than you have, he said. Our security team flagged him when his funds started circling the clean energy division, over a year ago now. When your wife's name showed up in the same report, I had Catherine document everything and keep it off the network. He paused. The kind of pause that told you what was coming wasn't easy for him either. I'm not telling you this because I wanted to test you, or her. I'm telling you because I couldn't build something for 50 years and then leave you to defend it blind. He looked directly into the camera before he added the line I'd carry with me longer than almost anything else he ever said to me. I didn't interfere in your marriage. That was never my place. But I could make sure that when the truth surfaced, and it would surface, you'd have everything you needed to see it clearly, and to act from strength, not from shock. The recording ended on a note that wasn't quite goodbye. My father never did goodbyes well. He preferred instructions. I sat in that chair a long time after the screen went dark. The grief I'd been carrying since Tuesday morning shifted into something with no clean name. My father had watched this coming for over a year. He'd built me a shelter before the storm even had a shape. And he'd done it without once making me feel managed or surveilled or handled like an asset instead of a son. That was the most Harold Reed thing he could possibly have done. Cold, in a way strangers would call it. Love in the only dialect he'd ever fully mastered. Catherine gave me an hour before the reading of the will began. The Havenwood Library could seat about 60 in the arrangement they'd built for the occasion, rows of chairs facing a long table, where Catherine would stand with a folder and 2 legal associates flanking her like witnesses to a verdict nobody had heard yet. I found a seat near the back. Wanted the room, not the front of it. Angela had already positioned herself and Victor near the front, close to the board members, which told me everything about how she'd spent her hour, not grieving, not even processing them. Working the room, the way you'd work a room at a gala, except the man being buried was mine, not a stranger's. Lorraine sat beside her, posture rigid, face arranged into something meant to pass for dignified sorrow. She'd clearly practiced it in a mirror. Catherine read the disposition clearly, no editorial commentary, no softening. My father left me the entirety of Havenwood Manor and its surrounding acreage. He left me 64% of the voting shares in Reed Meridian Holdings, along with full control of the family's private investment networks, research, endowments, and real estate holdings. The estimated value of the estate exceeded $47 billion. There was also a clause, drafted by Catherine, signed 2 years earlier. No spouse, no relative by marriage, no outside partner could access family shareholdings without written authorization signed by Darnell Cooper Reed, in full. No exceptions carved in for anyone standing in that room. The room absorbed it in a silence that lasted about 4 seconds, long enough for me to hear my own pulse. Then Angela stood. She crossed the room. Reached for my hand like the last 2 hours had never happened, like the driveway and the bag and the word sweetheart had all belonged to some other man's morning. Less than 2 hours before, she'd told me our marriage was over through an open car door while her mother threw my bag into the gravel like trash. Now she was reaching for my hand in front of 60 strangers, already explaining to Catherine that as my wife, she would naturally be standing by my side through this difficult time. I pulled my hand back. Didn't say a word, didn't need to. The room had heard the same clause I had. Victor tried a different angle, stood, adjusted his jacket, introduced himself to Catherine as a financial advisor with an interest in supporting my transition into the role. Catherine looked at him the way you look at something you recognized a long time ago and had simply been waiting to say out loud. Mr. Bryant, she said. Yes, I know that name. Something in the way she said it made 3 people in the front row look down at their hands like the carpet had suddenly become interesting. I understood, in that exact moment, the full shape of what had been quietly assembled around my marriage while I was too busy grieving to see it clearly. Victor hadn't pursued Angela because she was compelling, though she was. He hadn't stayed because he felt something real, though he'd performed it well enough to fool a woman I once believed couldn't be fooled. He stayed because he believed she was a door, them. And he'd been patient, careful, deliberate about positioning himself directly in front of it, waiting for the lock to turn. That realization didn't make what Angela did smaller. If anything, it made it heavier, more complicated, the kind of weight that doesn't resolve itself in one sitting. Because some part of her had let herself be used, and some part of her had used it right back. That night, Angela asked for a private conversation. Said Victor meant nothing. Said the dinners and the gifts had been professional relationship building. Nothing more. The pressure of feeling like she was living below her potential had warped her judgment temporarily. When she saw that wasn't landing, she pivoted completely. Told me I'd built the whole marriage on a lie. That 8 years of concealing my father's identity was a fundamental betrayal. That she'd been a participant in a test she never agreed to take. There was enough truth buried in that framing to make it hard to dismiss clean. I think she knew that. I think she was counting on it. Lorraine backed every version of the argument with the particular conviction of a woman who had never once in her life considered she might be wrong about anything. She told anyone who'd listened that the Reed family had used her daughter as an unwitting subject in some kind of social experiment, that Angela was the real victim of the day. Victor, meanwhile, had been busy. He'd spent those same hours calling 3 board members with long-standing reservations about succession men who'd served under my father, and had legitimate professional skepticism about handing $47 billion to someone whose public resume consisted of church restorations in Central Virginia. He'd also reached Angela's laptop, through means that wouldn't become clear until later. Pulled documents from the estate's preliminary transfer files and altered specific passages to suggest the Reed family had been surveilling Angela as part of a deliberate campaign against her. Those altered documents reached 3 journalists by the following morning. Because Victor didn't just want the company, he wanted the chaos too. Chaos was where men like him did their best work. I found out about the leak the same way most people did a headline on a phone screen. Out of context. Half-true. Damaging regardless. I stood in the hallway outside my father's study, reading it twice before the words settled, and something in my chest went cold and precise in a way grief hadn't managed to do all week. Angela's legal team filed a motion that afternoon requesting a temporary freeze on my voting rights while her claim was under review. A judge granted a limited version of it before dinner. Which meant that on the same day I buried my father, I was already fighting to keep the thing he'd spent 50 years building from being pulled apart by people who'd known him for exactly 0 of those years. Victor moved into the opening that created them. Presented the board with a proposal, a controlled sale of the clean energy division to an investment group that Catherine would later confirm he quietly controlled through a chain of shell arrangements nobody outside his own legal team had bothered to trace. 2 board members signaled they were open to discussing it. Then the footage from the gatehouse leaked online. 40 seconds, Angela opening the passenger door, the bag hitting gravel. Victor sliding into my seat, the screen flashing my name. By morning it had been viewed more than 40 million times. Talk shows argued about whether I was a wronged husband or a manipulative billionaire who'd let his own wife humiliate herself for the optics. The story had escaped every room it started in and become public property that nobody was managing correctly. Least of all me. I went back to my father's study that night, took the brass clock off the mantel, held it the way I used to watch him hold it when he was working through something difficult, turning it over like the weight of it might answer a question words couldn't. Then I set it down, found Catherine still at her desk in the adjoining room, and told her I wasn't sure my father had chosen the right man for this. A man who spent his career rebuilding structures other people had abandoned, was now supposed to govern a global company while a court order restricted his authority. A board ally was quietly engineering the sale of a core division. His wife was casting herself as a victim in a story the entire country was watching unfold in real time. And a 40-second video was being dissected by strangers who'd never once set foot in this county, who wouldn't know Havenwood from any other gate in Virginia. I told her I was considering stepping back from the succession entirely, letting someone with a resume built for this take it instead. She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I almost took it back. "You've heard the summary," she said. "Now read all of it, every word he wrote." She set the handwritten letter from the wooden box on the desk in front of me. 4 pages, front and back. My father's handwriting smaller and more compressed than I remembered. The kind of script that told you every word had been chosen before. The pen ever touched the page, then she left. closed the door behind her without another word. I opened the letter. Most of it was practical instructions about specific board relationships, notes on the long-term structure of the clean energy division, a short list of the people inside the company he trusted without reservation. But toward the end, there was a paragraph that had nothing to do with business at all. There will be a moment, he'd written, when you have everything you need to ruin them completely. The evidence will be in your hands, the platform will be yours, and the temptation will feel like justice. He'd underlined the next line twice. I need you to understand that it isn't them. I read it again, then a third time, slower, like the words might change their meaning if I stared at them long enough. Because that's the thing about grief and rage sitting in the same chest. At the same time they start whispering the same argument, and it's hard to tell which one is actually talking. I set the letter down, looked at the offline drive sitting quiet on the desk, holding whatever else my father had decided I needed to see. Then I picked up the clock, wound it slow, careful, the way I'd watched him do it 100 times without ever once thinking I'd have to do it myself, put it back on the mantle, went to find Catherine. I told her I wasn't stepping back, told her I needed to go through everything on that drive, all of it, every file, every recording, and that I wanted the board meeting moved up. Tomorrow morning, no more waiting for the chaos to organize itself into something manageable. She looked at me without surprise, like this was the conclusion she'd been waiting for me to reach on my own timeline the whole time, patient the way my father used to be patient, letting the storm arrive instead of trying to talk it out of coming. I'll make the calls, she said, outside the study window, The last of the daylight was folding itself over the east lawn, and somewhere past the tree line I could hear the fountain my father never let anyone shut off, running steady into the dark like it hadn't heard the news yet, I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, because tomorrow the fight would have a shape. Tonight it still just felt like standing in a house that used to be my father's and was now, against every instinct I had, mine. Catherine gave me an hour before the reading began, I spent most of it standing at the window of my father's study, watching staff arrange the last rows of chairs in the library below, and trying to remember how to breathe like a man walking into a room instead of a man walking into an ambush. The Havenwood Library held 60 people that morning, rows facing a long table, Catherine at the center of it with a folder and 2 legal associates flanking her like she was about to deliver a verdict, not a will. I found a seat near the back, Angela had already claimed a spot up front, close to the board, which told me exactly how she'd spent her hour not grieving, not even pretending to grieve, but working a room like it was a fundraiser and my father's. Death was the invitation. Lorraine sat beside her, spine straight, face arranged into something that was trying very hard to pass for dignified sorrow. Catherine read the disposition without a single note of drama in her voice, because that's who she was. Precision instead of theater. Havenwood Manor and its acreage, mine. 64% voting control of Reed Meridian Holdings, mine. The investment networks, the endowments, the real estate, mine. $47 billion, give or take a rounding error most people would spend their whole lives chasing. And then the clause, No spouse, no relative by marriage, no outside partner could touch a single share without my signature. Written, dated, signed 2 years before any of us knew this morning was coming. The room went quiet for 4 seconds. Then Angela stood, crossed the room, reached for my hand like the driveway never happened, like her mother hadn't dropped my bag on the gravel 2 hours earlier, like the word sweetheart hadn't been retired the second Victor took my seat. I pulled my hand back, didn't say, didn't need to. The room had heard the same clause I had. Victor tried next. Stood, straightened his jacket, introduced himself to Catherine as a financial advisor interested in supporting my transition. Catherine looked at him the way you look at a name you've been waiting to say out loud for a year, Mr. Bryant. Yes, I know that name. 3 people in the front row studied their shoes. That night Angela came to find me in the East Wing, said Victor meant nothing. Said the dinners. The gifts, all of it was professional relationship building. Nothing more. And the pressure of feeling like she was living below her own potential had warped her judgment temporarily. When that didn't land, she changed the whole argument. Told me I'd built our entire marriage on a lie. That 8 years of hiding my father's name from her was a betrayal deep enough to justify anything she'd done since. There was truth buried in it. Enough truth to make it hard to throw out clean. I think she knew that. I think that's exactly why she reached for it. Lorraine backed every version with the conviction of a woman who'd never once considered she might be wrong. Told anyone who'd listened that the Reed family had used her daughter as an unwitting subject in some kind of social experiment. Victor, meanwhile, was calling 3 board members. Men with legitimate professional doubts about handing $47 billion to someone whose public resume consisted of restoring church rafters in Central Virginia. By morning, 3 journalists had documents, altered, reworked to suggest the Reed family had been surveilling Angela on purpose, engineering her humiliation for optics. A judge signed a limited freeze on my voting rights that afternoon. Victor moved into the gap it created. Proposed a controlled sale of the clean energy division. To an investment group Catherine would later confirm he quietly controlled through a chain of shell arrangements nobody had bothered tracing. 2 board members said they'd hear him out. Then the gate footage leaked. 40 seconds. 40 million views by morning. Talk shows arguing over whether I was a wronged husband or a billionaire who let his wife humiliate herself on camera for sympathy. I went back to my father's study that night, picked up the brass clock, held it the way I used to watch him hold it when something wasn't sitting right in his chest. Found Catherine at her desk. Told her I wasn't sure my father had picked the right man. She didn't argue. She set the full letter in front of me instead. 4 pages. His handwriting small and deliberate, every word chosen before the pen ever touched the page. Most of it was business. Board relationships. Structure notes on the clean energy division. 3 names he trusted without reservation. Then, near the end, the paragraph that wasn't business at all. There will be a moment when you have everything you need to ruin them completely. The evidence will be in your hands, the platform will be yours, and the temptation will feel like justice. I need you to understand that it isn't. He'd underlined the next line twice. If you use what you have to punish them in front of the world, you'll become exactly the man they've been describing. Cold, calculated, willing to destroy people to protect your position. That's not what I built this for, and it's not who your mother raised. I read it 3 times, set it down, wound the clock the way I'd watched him do it 100 times without ever once thinking I'd have to do it myself. Told Catherine I wasn't stepping back, told her I needed everything on that drive. All of it, and I wanted the board meeting moved to the morning. That was where part 1 ended. This is where the storm actually starts working. We spent the whole night going through it. Catherine at one end of the desk with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, me at the other, filling up faster than either of us could organize it into anything resembling a strategy. The lamp threw a small warm circle of light onto the desk and left the rest of the study in shadow, which somehow made the material feel heavier than it already was. Communication logs, transaction records, a folder of emails between Victor and 2 board members that spelled out, in plain, unguarded language, exactly what each of them stood to gain if the sale went through. And then the recording. Not the 40-second clip that had already gone viral, already been sliced and reposted and argued over by strangers who thought they understood something about my marriage from a phone screen. The full gatehouse feed, every second of it, including the conversation in the car before the SUV ever reached the checkpoint. Victor's voice, laying out which executives he planned to approach at the service, what he expected Angela to help arrange once they were inside them. And Angela's voice underneath it, different from the voice she'd used in the library, quieter, smaller. The voice of someone being led somewhere she hadn't fully agreed to go, even if some part of her had stopped resisting a long time before that morning. I noted it, set it aside, because the board meeting needed a strategy, not a reckoning, and I didn't have room in my chest that night for both. Catherine caught me staring at the same paragraph in Victor's email for the 3rd time and didn't say anything about it. Just reached over, turned the page for me, and said the sentence I'd end up hearing in my head for the rest of the week. Grief makes people careless. Don't let it make you careless too. Which was fair, which was also easier to hear than to actually follow. At 2 in the morning, with my father's handwriting still sitting open on the desk between us like a wound that hadn't decided whether it wanted to close. Around 3, going through a folder labeled with nothing but a date, I found the Booker file. Except it wasn't Booker anymore in this version of the story. It was labeled Cooper, my mother's name, the one my father had given me at 8 years old to keep me safe from men exactly like Victor Bryant. Inside was a letter, short, handwritten in a script rounder and less deliberate than my father's, the kind of handwriting that hadn't had 50 years to compress itself into something efficient. My mother's dated 3 weeks before she died. I was 11, she never sent it. My father had kept it 27 years, waiting apparently for exactly this kind of night. She wrote that she knew, even then, that I'd one day face a choice about who I was, that some people would see me for what I had, and some people would see me for who I actually was. She said she hoped I'd be wise enough to know the difference, and brave enough to choose correctly, even when the correct choice cost more than the easy one. She signed off with a line that landed somewhere under my ribs and stayed there. "You don't have to prove your worth to anyone, Darnell, least of all to yourself." I sat with that letter longer than I should have, given the sun was already starting to threaten the horizon and the board meeting was 6 hours away. Catherine didn't rush me. Just quietly stood, put a hand briefly on my shoulder, and stepped out to give me the room. Because some things you can't process with an audience, even an audience of one who already knows everything about you. I thought about my mother's kitchen, about the smell of her cooking on Sunday afternoons before the cancer took the strength out of her hands. About how she never once in 11 years made me feel like the Reed name was a shadow I was hiding in instead of a choice my father had made to protect me. And I thought about Angela, about the version of her that sat with me in that hospital waiting room 6 years ago. About whether that version still existed somewhere underneath everything Victor had rebuilt on top of her, or whether it had been gone longer than either of us wanted to admit. Until Catherine knocked on the doorframe at 6 and said the board was starting to arrive. The formal meeting room at Havenwood ran the length of the north wing. Wood paneling my father had personally selected 40 years ago. Windows looking out over the eastern lawn, where the light that morning came in flat and gray, no warmth in it at all. A table that seated 20, though only 14 chairs would end up filled that day. Victor arrived with the 2 board members who'd signaled they were open to his proposal. They came in together, which told me they'd already met that morning, already agreed on their approach, already decided how this was going to go before I'd even had coffee. Victor positioned himself near the head of the table, easy confidence. The posture of a man who'd rehearsed this room in his head a dozen times and found it favorable every single time. He opened by addressing the board directly. Said the current situation, a contested succession, an active court order, a scandal playing out across every major outlet in the country, created conditions that were genuinely dangerous for the company's stability. Said a controlled divestiture of the clean energy division would protect asset value, while the governance questions worked themselves out. Said the word stewardship 3 times, like repetition might make it true. He was good, I'll give him that. Good enough that 2 board members were nodding by the time he finished. Good enough that if I hadn't spent the entire night reading the paper trail behind his charm, I might have believed him myself. I let him finish. Then I stood, told the board that before we discussed any transactions, they needed the full context of what had brought us into this room. Told them I'd start with something I should have addressed a long time before that morning. I concealed the truth of my identity from my wife for the entire length of our marriage. That was wrong. I wasn't asking them to weigh in on my marriage. I was putting it on the table plainly, because what came next required them to hear it from a man who'd already accounted for his own failures, not a man standing there pretending he had none. Then I nodded to Catherine. She presented the material methodically. Logs first, then the transaction structure, then the emails, laid out in order, dates highlighted, names underlined where they connected to each other in ways the board hadn't been shown before. The room got quiet, in that particular way rooms go quiet when people realize they've been watching something from the wrong angle the entire time. Then Catherine played the audio, first recording, Victor's voice warm, telling Angela that once the transition was complete, once they had what they needed from the company, they could move forward together. Second recording, 3 days later. A call with one of Victor's financial partners, his voice colder now, more efficient. Angela had served her purpose. He'd exit the personal arrangement as soon as the signatures were secured. He said it the way you'd discuss closing a position in a market you no longer needed exposure to. Angela was seated near the back of the room. She'd come with her own attorney and had stayed composed right up until that second recording started playing. I watched her face while it ran. No tears, no outburst. She just went very still, the particular stillness of someone hearing something they'd already suspected confirmed out loud, in front of witnesses with no room left to pretend otherwise. I'd seen that exact stillness on her face once before, years earlier, a different context entirely. And recognizing it now in this room made me feel something I hadn't expected to feel sitting across from the woman who'd thrown my bag onto gravel less than 48 hours earlier. Sorrow, not for myself. For whatever version of her had been quietly taken apart by someone who knew exactly which pieces to remove first. The 2 board members who'd aligned with Victor didn't speak again for the rest of the session. The remaining board voted, rejected the sale, suspended both members pending formal review, referred the whole mess, the data theft, the altered documents, the coordinated manipulation of a governance process to federal investigators, Catherine presented the original unaltered succession documents. The board voted to formally recognize me as Harold Reed's sole heir and the new chair of Reed Meridian Holdings. The motion passed with a margin that left no room for ambiguity. Victor left the building with his legal team without speaking to anyone. Didn't look at Angela on his way out. I should have felt something like triumph in that moment. I didn't. What I felt was closer to exhaustion, the kind that comes after you've been holding your breath so long you forget what regular breathing feels like. Which was when Jonathan Wright asked to speak with Catherine privately, one of the two suspended board members. 61 years old, on the board longer than I'd been alive, a man my father had trusted enough to bring onto the founding committee of the Clean Energy Division 15 years earlier. His attorney arranged the meeting for that same afternoon. I sat in on it, mostly out of a need to understand how deep this thing actually went, and partly because some instinct told me the story wasn't finished unfolding. Jonathan didn't try to defend what he'd done, said instead that he hadn't been the one who started it, said 7 years earlier he'd made a bad personal investment, bad enough to threaten the retirement he'd spent 30 years building, and Victor had known, had used it, had held it over him quietly, patiently, the same way he'd held Angela's insecurities over her. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me, Jonathan said, voice low, worn down in a way that made him look older than 61. I made the choice. I'm just telling you I didn't start out looking to hurt anybody. I didn't say much in response. Didn't offer forgiveness, because it wasn't mine to give in a legal sense, and the consequences were already moving forward whether I softened toward him or not. But something in it stayed with me, because Victor hadn't just manipulated my wife. He'd made a career out of finding exactly where people were breakable and pressing there until they cracked open in whatever direction served him best. That wasn't an excuse for Jonathan. It was a warning about the size of the thing we'd actually been fighting. That evening, back in the study, Catherine and I sat with the last of the paperwork spread across the desk, and for the first time in 3 days, neither of us said anything for a long stretch. The house had gone quiet around us. Staff finished for the day. The fountain outside the window the only sound left in the building. 8 months, Catherine finally said, not looking up from the folder in front of her. That's roughly how long it'll take the board to fully stabilize behind you. If you do this the way your father would have. I asked her what that meant, exactly. Doing it his way. She looked up then. Show up prepared every time. Ask the questions the reports actually raise. Not the questions that make you sound like you belong in the room. A pause. He spent 10 years earning that board's trust. You don't get to skip the work just because you inherited the seat. I told her I didn't want to skip it. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Good. Because nobody in that room is going to hand you what your father earned. You're going to have to earn a version of it yourself. I thought about that on the drive back to Richmond 2 days later, the first time I'd left Havenwood since the funeral. The first time I'd sat in my own truck instead of a company car. Radio off. Windows cracked despite the cold. Just to hear something other than my own thoughts circling the same 3 questions. What Angela had actually known and when. What my father had actually protected me from, and at what cost to himself. And what kind of man I was going to choose to be now that the choice was actually mine to make instead of theoretical. Angela called twice that week. I let both go to voicemail. Not out of cruelty, out of the simple practical need to figure out what I believed before I let her voice back into the equation and complicated it further. She left one message, short, no explanation, no apology, dressed up as one. I know you probably hate me right now. Her voice thin through the phone speaker, none of the polish from the library reading left in it. I don't even blame you. I need you to know I'm not the person you saw in that boardroom. Or I don't want to be her anymore. I didn't call back. Not that week. Because some sentences need time to prove themselves before you let them mean anything. The federal investigation into Victor moved faster than Catherine expected. Within 10 days. 2 of his financial partners had distanced themselves publicly. Careful corporate language about concerning allegations and ongoing review. The kind of statement lawyers write when they're trying to survive a fire without admitting they were ever near it. Lorraine, in the meantime, discovered exactly how quickly a social circle can close its doors once the story attached to your name stops being flattering. I heard about it secondhand. A mutual acquaintance mentioned. Lorraine had been quietly dropped from 2 charity boards within a month. The kind of erasure that happens without anyone ever saying it out loud. I didn't take satisfaction in that. Or I tried not to. Some nights I mostly just felt tired of watching people's lives rearrange themselves around a scandal that had started with a gate camera and a 40-second clip nobody asked permission to film them. 3 weeks after the board meeting, I moved into the east wing of Havenwood full-time. Not because I decided to abandon Richmond. I kept the house, kept the truck, kept the weekend habit of driving out to whatever job site needed an extra set of hands, but because the company needed a chairman who showed up, and showing up meant being where the work actually was. The first month tested every assumption I had about what I was capable of. I sat through budget reviews that used language I had to look up afterward quietly, at my desk, so nobody would catch me Googling terms a chairman should already know cold. I made mistakes in 2 early meetings, small ones, the kind that get corrected with a raised eyebrow instead of a headline, but mistakes all the same. I learned fast. That running a $47 billion company had almost nothing in common with restoring a church bell tower except, for one thing, patience. The same patience it takes to work 100 years of decay back into something standing straight, just applied to people instead of limestone. Catherine stayed close through all of it. Not hovering, she wasn't built for hovering, but present, in the specific way my father used to describe as showing up before anyone asks you to. She flagged the meetings where I needed to speak up. She stayed quiet in the ones where silence would teach me more than advice could. One afternoon, going over quarterly projections neither of us fully trusted, she set her pen down and asked a question that had nothing to do with the numbers in front of us. "Do you regret it?" Taking the seat, I thought about it honestly before answering. Some days. Which days? The days I think about how much easier it'd be to just go fix something with my hands instead of my signature. She nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something she'd already suspected about me. "Your father used to say the same thing, different words, same feeling." That surprised me. My father had never once, in all our conversations over the years, admitted to wanting anything simpler than the empire he'd built. "He didn't say it to you," Catherine said, reading the surprise on my face before I could hide it. "He'd said it to your mother. I only know because she told me once a long time before you were born." Said Harold used to talk about walking away from all of it and opening a hardware store somewhere nobody knew his name. I didn't know what to do with that information. Still don't fully. But it sat differently in my chest than most of what I'd learned that month, softer somehow. Like it made my father less of a myth and more of a man who'd made the same trade I was making now, just decades earlier, with higher stakes and less room for regret. Angela called a third time in early December. This time I answered. Her voice was different, steadier than the voicemail, but not performing steady the way it had in the library. Just steady. The way someone sounds after they've cried enough times that the crying stops being the loudest part of the conversation. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," she said. "I know that probably sounds like something someone says right before they ask for something." I didn't say anything. Waited. I started seeing someone. Not because my lawyer told me to, she didn't. Actually, I think she'd rather I stayed angry. It plays better in front of a judge. A short, humorless laugh. I started because I woke up about a week after the board meeting and realized I didn't actually know who I was without either your name or Victor's attention, and that scared me more than losing the money ever did. I asked her, carefully, what she wanted me to do with that information. "Nothing," she said. "I don't want you to do anything with it. I just didn't want the last thing you knew about me to be the woman in that video." We didn't talk long after that. A few more sentences, nothing resolved, nothing promised. But something in the tone of it stuck with me longer than I expected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first crack of daylight in a door I'd assumed was welded shut. Mid-December, Jonathan Wright's formal review concluded. He lost his board seat permanently. Lost his license to serve on any publicly regulated entity for 5 years. It was harsher than I'd expected, and I found myself oddly, not entirely at peace with how harsh it was. I mentioned that to Catherine one evening, the two of us going over year-end filings in the study. The same desk where I'd read my father's letter for the first time. "You feel sorry for him," she said. "Not a question." "Some," I admitted. "He didn't start this. Victor found the crack in him and worked it open. That doesn't make what he did right. But it's not the same as being Victor." Catherine set her pen down, considered that for a moment longer than I expected. "Your father used to say something about that too, that there's a difference between closing a door on someone who's wronged you and locking it forever. He said the trick was learning which one the situation actually called for." I asked her which one this was. She didn't answer right away. "I think that's still yours to figure out, not mine." The clean energy division stabilized by the end of January. largely because Catherine and I spent 6 straight weeks meeting with every executive under that umbrella personally, learning names, learning what actually kept the division running instead of what the reports claimed kept it running. My father had built the division on relationships as much as infrastructure, and I was slowly starting to understand that governing it meant maintaining both. One of the younger engineers on the water technology side, a woman not much younger than me, sharp, unimpressed by titles, pulled me aside after a site visit outside Danville and said something I didn't expect. "You ask better questions than most executives who've been doing this 20 years. I told her that was probably because I'd spent 15 years asking buildings why they'd failed before I ever asked a balance sheet the same question. She laughed, actually laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard directed at me since the funeral. Different foundations, same instinct. It stayed with me longer than it should have, that phrase. Different foundations, same instinct. Because was that, in the end, exactly what my father had spent 50 years trying to teach me, without ever saying it directly, that whether you were rebuilding a courthouse or steering a $47 billion company, the work asked the same thing of you. Attention, patience, the willingness to see what was actually broken instead of what was convenient to blame. By February, the federal case against Victor had expanded well past securities manipulation into wire fraud and coordinated data theft, charges serious enough that even his own attorneys were reportedly encouraging him toward a plea rather than a trial. Catherine kept me updated through weekly briefings, careful never to let the updates turn into something that resembled gloating. "You don't need to celebrate this," she told me once, closing the folder on the latest filing. "The system's doing its job. Your job is somewhere else." I asked her where. "Building something your father would recognize as worth the cost." That sentence sat with me through the rest of that gray Virginia winter, through board meetings that slowly stopped feeling like ambushes and started feeling like work. Through the first weekend in months I let myself drive back to Richmond just to stand inside a half-restored chapel outside Petersburg and remember what my hands were for before any of this started. The chapel's stone facade had been crumbling for decades before I got to it, the kind of decay most contractors would look at and recommend demolition instead of repair, the math never working out in favor of saving something that old. I stood in the nave that Saturday, running a hand along a section of restored limestone I'd finished 18 months earlier, and thought about my father's letter. There will be a moment when you have everything you need to ruin them completely. I had that moment already. Behind me, in the boardroom, in the courtroom filings, in the 40 million views of a video I never asked to have taken. I'd had it, and mostly I'd let it pass without reaching for it the way Victor would have. Mostly. Because there was still Angela's voicemail sitting unanswered in some deeper way than the phone call I'd finally taken. Still Lorraine circling the edges of whatever came next, quieter now but not gone. Still a version of justice I hadn't fully decided how to define for myself, standing in a chapel that had taught me everything I knew about second chances, wondering if I actually believed in them, or if I was just quoting my father's letter back to myself because it was easier than deciding on my own. The answer, when it came, wouldn't arrive in that chapel. It would arrive later, in a garden near a fountain my father never let anyone turn off. But standing there that February afternoon, hands still resting against stone I'd spent months coaxing back into something whole, I understood for the first time since the gate opened for me instead of her that the hardest part of this wasn't proving I deserved the inheritance. It was deciding what kind of man I was going to be now that nobody could stop me from becoming anyone I wanted. I asked Terry to give me a few minutes alone in the garden the morning after the board finalized the divestiture ruling. Not because I needed solitude exactly. Because I needed the fountain, the one sound in this whole house that hadn't changed shape since I was a boy. The garden ran along the south face of Havenwood. Boxwood hedges trimmed into shapes older than me. Stone paths worn smooth by 3 generations of feet that weren't mine yet somehow still were. My father used to say the fountain helped him think. I never understood that until I stood there myself, hands in my coat pockets, watching water fall over the same worn granite lip it had fallen over since before I was born. Which is where Angela found me. She came out through the side door, stood a few feet away, didn't try to close the distance. She didn't try to explain herself the way she had that first night. No performance left in her posture. Just a woman standing in a garden she used to think she'd inherit, finally saying the thing she should have said months earlier. I knew something was wrong with him, she said. Not at first. At first I believed exactly what he was showing me. A pause long enough that the fountain filled it. but somewhere in the middle of it, I knew. And I kept going anyway, because I'd already decided that whatever he was better than what I had. She looked at the water instead of me. I think I told myself that story so many times I started performing it instead of feeling it. And at some point I couldn't tell the difference anymore. I thought about the hospital waiting room, about the drive-through rain 6 years earlier. No complaints. No hesitation. Just a man showing up because that's what showing up meant to him. I thought about how long I'd watched the woman I married slowly replace herself with someone she thought the world would take more seriously, and how long I'd kept waiting for the original to come back, instead of accepting the harder truth, that people move in the direction of their choices, not their origins. Money didn't make you cruel, Angela, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. It just gave you a reason to stop hiding the choices you were already making. I said it without anger, because by that point the anger had mostly burned itself down into something closer to clarity, the kind that doesn't need volume to land. I hope you figure out who you actually are, I added when nobody's watching. I mean that. She didn't answer, just nodded once, small, and went back inside. I didn't use what I had to take anything from her beyond what was right. That part mattered to me more than I expected it to going in. The divorce proceeded on the terms the law required. Nothing dramatic, nothing punitive. She received what she was entitled to from 8 years of shared life, not $1 more, not $1 less. She did not receive access to the Havenwood estate or its holdings, and her attorney didn't fight that particular clause with much conviction, because there wasn't much room to fight it. Victor's case moved through federal court that spring with the kind of grinding inevitability that makes headlines feel almost anticlimactic by the time the verdict actually lands. Securities manipulation, data theft, coordinated fraud spanning at least 4 separate schemes his legal team hadn't managed to keep hidden. His remaining partners released statements distancing themselves within 72 hours of the indictment. Careful corporate language doing exactly what careful corporate language is designed to do. Lorraine discovered, over roughly the same stretch of months, that the social circles she'd spent decades cultivating had quietly closed their doors. Every woman in those rooms knew by now exactly who had dropped the bag onto the gravel. Nobody said it out loud at the luncheons she stopped being invited to. They didn't need to. None of them lost everything because I decided to destroy them. That distinction mattered to me, sitting with it in the months that followed. They lost what they'd been reaching for because they'd built towards something that was never real to begin with, and when the structure underneath it finally gave way, there was nothing solid left to hold on to. The board stabilized through that spring with a steadiness that surprised people who'd expected a prolonged power struggle to drag on for years. I came to every meeting prepared. Asked the questions the reports actually raised instead of the ones designed to signal authority I hadn't earned yet. Made decisions based on documents instead of whatever pressure happened to be loudest in the room that week. 8 months after the reading of the will, Catherine sat across the desk from me during a routine quarterly review and set her pen down mid-sentence. Your father spent 10 years earning this board's trust, she said. You did it in 8 months. I told her my father had done the harder work, making sure I understood what trust was actually for before I was ever in a position to need it. Which brought me, eventually, to a decision I'd been circling since February without quite admitting it to myself. I kept the house in Richmond. Still drove back most weekends. Still took on restoration projects when the scope was right. Not because I needed the income, or was performing some version of humility for an audience that would never see it anyway. Because those buildings were where I'd learned everything I knew about the patience required to repair something the world had already decided wasn't worth saving. That knowledge turned out to transfer further than I expected. A portion of Havenwood, the old carriage house and the fields behind it, unused for as long as I could remember, became a vocational training center. Free. Open to young people from low-income households across the county, staffed by instructors paid properly. Because my father had always believed education delivered on the cheap produces results worth exactly what they cost. The first cohort started that September. 22 students, most of them from towns close enough to Havenwood that they'd grown up hearing about the estate without ever imagining they'd set foot inside its gates. One of them was a 19-year-old named Cedric Mitchell, quiet, sharp-handed, the kind of kid who fixed things around his mother's house because nobody else in the family had the patience to learn how. First week of the carpentry module, he asked me, hesitant, like he expected to be laughed at, whether restoration work was even a real career or just something rich people did for fun. I told him it was the realest work I'd ever done. Told him the first building I restored on my own, a Baptist church outside Charlottesville, took me 4 months and left me with almost nothing in my bank account and everything I needed to know about who I actually was. He didn't say much back, just nodded, went back to the joint he was cutting, got it right on the second try instead of the third. Watching him work that afternoon, something in my chest settled that hadn't settled in months. Because that was the whole point, wasn't it? Not the 47 billion, not the boardroom victories, this. A kid learning his hands could build something that outlasted him. Unused land on the eastern section of the property was developed that same year into housing, modest, well-built, nothing performative about it for staff, families, and veterans. I established the Harold Reed Foundation for Community Preservation that fall, funded from company earnings, dedicated to restoring schools, libraries, and water infrastructure in towns the larger economy had quietly written off. We started in Danville, then 3 towns in West Virginia where the water systems hadn't been properly maintained since before I was born. Then 5 towns spread across eastern Kentucky, places where the nearest working library was sometimes an hour's drive away. No ribbon cuttings staged for cameras. My father built an empire almost entirely out of public view, and something in me understood, instinctively, that this work belonged to the same discretion. Except discretion has its limits when you're trying to hire contractors and coordinate with local school boards across 3 states. And by early winter word had started spreading anyway, not through press releases, but through the slower, more honest channel of people telling other people that something real was happening in towns nobody usually paid attention to. A superintendent in one of the Kentucky districts called Catherine directly to ask if the rumors were true. She confirmed them. He asked, almost disbelieving, why a company that size would care about a library roof in a town of 1,100 people. Catherine's answer, relayed to me secondhand, stuck with me for weeks afterward, because the man who runs it used to fix roofs for a living. He knows what it costs a town to lose one. In late October, almost a year to the week after my father's death, I drove to North Carolina alone. No security detail, no assistant trailing behind with a phone full of scheduling conflicts. Just me and 6 hours of highway and a stop for gas somewhere past Greensboro that felt longer than it should have. My mother was buried outside a small town I hadn't visited since I was maybe 15. The cemetery sat behind a white clapboard church, modest, well kept by a congregation that had no idea the man walking through their gate that afternoon controlled a company worth more than their entire county's annual revenue several times over. I found her headstone easier than I expected. Deborah Cooper, the dates. Nothing else. My father had kept the marker simple, the way she would have wanted it. No mention of the Reed name anywhere on the stone because that had never been who she was. I stood there a long time, longer than I'd planned. The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the cemetery, and somewhere past the treeline a dog barked twice and went quiet. And I found myself talking to her the way you talk to someone you know can't hear you but need to hear it said out loud anyway. I told her about the boardroom, about Victor, about the recordings, about the moment I'd had every piece of leverage I needed to burn Angela's whole reputation to the ground and chose not to. I told her about the letter she'd left in the file my father kept for 27 years, waiting for the exact night I'd need it most. I told her I understood now what she'd meant about proving my worth, that I hadn't fully understood it at 11, grieving her in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet, but I understood it now. Standing over her grave with a company's worth of decisions sitting on my shoulders and none of them mattering as much as this one conversation I was having with a woman who'd been gone 27 years. I brought a small printed copy of her letter, left it tucked against the base of the headstone, weighted down with a stone from the church parking lot, and drove back to Virginia that same evening with the radio off the entire way. 14 months after the morning at the gate, a letter arrived at Havenwood, handwritten, regular postage, nothing expedited or urgent about the way it was sent, which somehow made it land harder than if it had come by courier. Angela wrote that she'd started therapy almost immediately after the board meeting, that she'd stopped speaking to her mother 4 months earlier, and that the silence had been harder than she expected, harder than losing the marriage, in some ways, because at least the marriage had an ending she could point to. She'd left the communications job, was working now at a vocational center for unhoused women in Petersburg, for a fraction of what she used to make, doing intake and case coordination, work that had nothing glamorous about it and everything honest. She wrote that she wasn't expecting a response, wasn't expecting anything from me at all. She just wanted me to know she was trying to find the woman who'd sat in that hospital waiting room years earlier, and whether that woman was still somewhere in her, reachable if she kept looking. She signed it simply Angela. Not my wife, not your ex-wife, just her name, like she was trying to reintroduce herself to someone who used to know her. I read it 3 times. Then put it in the bottom drawer of my father's desk, my desk now, though some part of me still thought of it as his every time I sat down at it. I didn't respond, not because I was still angry. I wasn't, not in any way that would have made silence feel like punishment, but because I didn't think the letter was asking for a reply. Some letters get written because the writer needs to write them, not because they need an answer waiting on the other end. And I respected that too much to turn it into something it wasn't. 6 weeks later, a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Susan Miller, who'd known Angela since college and had somehow stayed neutral enough through the whole mess to keep talking to both of us, mentioned, almost in passing, that Angela had relocated to Petersburg full-time, that the job was suiting her, that she looked different now. Not different like richer or more put together, Susan said, choosing the words carefully like she wanted to get them exactly right. Different like more real. I nodded, didn't say much, but something in my chest eased at hearing it, the way it eases when a wound you've been checking every day finally starts closing on its own. That was news I was genuinely glad to hear. Winter arrived hard that year, ice storms rolling through the county twice in December, enough to close roads and strain the county's aging power grid in ways that reminded me exactly why the foundation's water and infrastructure work mattered as much as it did. I spent most of January splitting time between board oversight and site visits, trying to make sure the towns we'd committed to weren't left waiting on promises while a company worth billions sorted out its own leadership transition first. One January afternoon, in Danville, checking on the library restoration crew's progress, I ran into a woman named Kimberly Taylor, the branch's head librarian, who'd been running the place on a shoestring budget for 11 years before the foundation's money arrived. She showed me the new roof, showed me the reading room, still under scaffolding but taking shape, sunlight coming in through windows that had been boarded over for almost a decade. You know, she said, watching a crew member measure a section of trim, most people who come from money like yours send a check and a photographer. You actually show up. I told her showing up was the only part of this I actually knew how to do well. She laughed. Might be the most important part though, which stuck with me longer than I expected. Driving back to Havenwood that evening through fields gone brown and stiff with cold, because it was almost the exact sentence my mother used in the hospital waiting room story 6 years earlier, when she told me why she decided to marry me in the first place. Not because I impressed her, because I showed up. Funny how the same lesson kept circling back around, dressed in different clothes each time, waiting for me to actually learn it instead of just admiring it from a safe distance. 2 years, almost to the day, after the morning Angela stopped the SUV at the checkpoint, Catherine came into my study carrying a second wooden box, smaller than the first. Different wood, older, the kind of box that had clearly been sitting somewhere untouched for a long time before this exact moment. Your father left one more instruction, she said. He asked me to wait 2 years before giving you this. Wanted to make sure that by the time you saw it, you'd already settled into who you'd become, not who you were right after he died. I opened it slowly, some instinct in me already bracing for whatever was inside. A photograph, old, slightly faded at the edges, and a short note folded twice. The photograph was of my mother, standing in this exact garden, the one outside the window behind me, wearing a spring coat I had no memory of. She was laughing at something outside the frame. Holding a boy who could only have been 3 years old, me and my father stood just behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder. His own expression softer than I'd ever once seen it in 20 years of quiet visits and study conversations. It was the only photograph I'd ever seen with all 3 of us in it. My father had kept it hidden for 27 years. The note in his familiar compressed handwriting read, I kept this apart because there was a time I couldn't look at it without it costing me something I couldn't afford to lose in front of a boardroom. And then longer because I wanted you to see it when you were old enough to understand why I never said it louder. Your mother wanted you to have this photograph once you'd become the man you were always going to become, not before. You are her son, in every way that matters. I sat with the photograph a long time. Didn't cry. Exactly, something closer to a pressure finally releasing after 2 years of holding steady under weight I hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. I had it framed that same week. Set it on the desk, my desk. where anyone walking into the study would see it first, before the ledgers, before the awards, before anything else. The room had accumulated over decades of business being conducted inside it. A late spring afternoon that following April, I found myself standing at the front gate again, the same spot where my bag had hit the gravel 2 years earlier, though the gravel had long since been replaced, and the checkpoint booth had a newer screen mounted beside it now, standard security up, nothing sentimental about the hardware itself. Terry came out to walk with me up to the house, the way he sometimes did in the late afternoons when the lights started going gold through the tree line, and the whole property seemed to settle into itself for the evening. He asked me, the way he occasionally asked things he already suspected the answer to, whether I'd ever considered replacing the old gate entirely, building a new entrance given everything that had happened at this one. I told him no. The gate stayed exactly where it was. We walked up the drive together in the particular quiet Havenwood carried at that hour, the fountain the only sound cutting through the stillness, the light low and warm across the lawn my father used to walk every evening before dinner, back when I thought I understood everything about the kind of man he was and had actually understood almost nothing. At the front door, I looked up at the second-floor window of the study, the room where he'd sat in that same chair, recording a message for a son he trusted to eventually find solid ground beneath him. Even if it took losing almost everything first to get there, I said it quietly, mostly to myself, mostly to him, wherever he was. I didn't hold on to what you built by destroying them. I held on to it by not becoming them. The door opened. Terry stepped aside to let me through first, the way he always did, the way he'd done every single time since the morning he'd said welcome home and meant it more than anyone else standing at that gate that day. I went inside. Maybe that's the thing actually worth sitting with. Not the gate, not the number that flashed on that screen 2 years ago, not even the 40 million strangers who watched 40 seconds of my life and decided they understood something about it. The real question, the one that took me 2 years and a company and a mother's letter and a wife's confession in a garden to actually answer, is what we're building toward in the relationships we choose to keep. I didn't lose my marriage the day Angela told me to get out of the car. I lost it slowly, across 8 years of quiet moments where respect started disappearing and neither of us said a word about it while it happened. Money didn't create that damage. It just made it impossible to keep ignoring. The most powerful thing I did wasn't exposing Victor in that boardroom, wasn't the recordings or the vote or the $47 billion that came with my name once the dust settled. It was walking out of that room afterward without becoming the kind of man who needed any of it to feel whole. Because that's the inheritance that actually mattered in the end. Not the acreage, not the shares, not the company my father spent 50 years building out of a small rail line in North Carolina. The letter, the one line he underlined twice, the one my mother wrote 27 years before I'd ever need to read it, both of them saying, in their own separate ways across their own separate decades, the exact same thing. You don't have to prove your worth to anyone, least of all to yourself. I think about that most evenings now, standing at that same window where my father used to stand, watching the fountain run in the dark the way it's run every night, for longer than I've been alive, long after everyone else in the house has gone to sleep. And I think, sometimes, about the version of me that stood in that gravel driveway 2 years ago, bag at his feet, watching taillights pull away toward a gate he didn't yet know was about to open for him instead. That man didn't know yet what he was about to inherit, and I don't just mean the money. He was about to inherit the choice. The one his father had been quietly protecting for him his entire life, without ever once explaining what it would eventually cost, or what it would eventually mean to finally have to make it on his own.